Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, 4 Famous Puzzles in the Philosophy of Language, with Russell and Frege. In this video, we're going to be looking at Frege's solutions to the last 2 puzzles and his theory of sense and reference. So, Frege wrote a famous paper on sense and reference, and in this video, we're going to explain a little bit about that theory, not in its entirety, but the basics and how that theory can solve the last 2 puzzles we've seen. So, Frege makes a distinction between the sense of a term and the reference of a term. All terms have a sense, or a way in which a proposition or object is expressed. 90/9 and 10, or Samuel Clemens and Mark Twain, have different senses, even though they denote or reference the same thing. A sense is basically the way in which we're expressing a term. So, we're expressing the same thing with 90/9 and 10, but we're doing it in different ways. We're expressing the same thing with Samuel Clemens and Mark Twain, but we're doing it in different ways. So they have different senses. This is distinguished from reference. So a reference is the actual object to which they refer. The morning star and the evening star refer to or denote the same object, even though they are using different senses to do it. It's important to note that words like dragon or the Borg Queen have distinct senses from each other, but don't have any denotation or reference. So, if a term fails to refer, it doesn't have a denotation, it doesn't have a reference. Now, how is this going to help us solve our puzzles? Let's see. For identity statements, our question at the end was, how can we account for the difference in cognitive significance between A equals A and A equals B when they're both true? While A and B have the same reference, they have different senses because they're expressing the same thing in different ways, as long as the statement A equals B is true. Therefore, while A equals A doesn't tell us anything interesting because it's just saying this sense and reference is the same as that same sense and reference, A equals B tells us that 2 different senses have the same reference, or that we're using these 2 different terms, A and B, to refer to the same thing. Therefore, it has a different meaning because it's comparing 2 senses and telling us that they have the same referent. So the reason that the morning star is the evening star has more cognitive significance than the morning star is the morning star is that the former tells us that 2 senses refer to the same object, while the latter simply tells us that a sense and reference are identical to themselves. This theory is also going to help us solve our puzzle of identity statements and our puzzle of propositional attitudes. So in intentional contexts, the reference of some term, according to Frege, is not what it normally denotes, but rather its sense. Therefore, the statement, John believes O. Henry is a writer, does not imply that John believes that William Sidney Porter is a writer. Since just because the references of O. Henry and William Sidney Porter are the same, it doesn't mean that the senses are in fact the same. And in intentional context, senses are what we're actually referring to, because John believes of that sense that the thing that it references is a good writer. And of this sense, he lacks a belief that the thing that it references is a good writer. So, because the senses are not the same, the argument is going to follow as valid. We're not allowed to substitute into these intentional contexts because what we're substituting into is not actually the same thing. It's not the reference, but rather the sense. In other words, when I say I claim to like eating Soylent Green, I'm saying this of this sense of this particular object. I will claim I like to eat it. But that does not mean that were I to discover that the object had another sense with which it was described, namely people, that I would claim to like to eat that. So that was a list of Frege's solutions to Frege's puzzle and propositional attitude reports using the theory of sense and reference. Next up, we'll look at the puzzle of the Bald King of France, then the puzzle of negative existentials, and finally, Russell's solutions to those 2 puzzles. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.